We did go backwards in Dobbs. I've said it's in my dissent, so I'm not saying something new, okay? We've taken away a right, and we've never done that in our history. Mind you, there are days that I've come to my office after an announcement of a case and closed my door and cried. There have been those days, and there are likely to be more.
An incredibly revealing moment of her own personal vulnerability from one of the 9 humans who sits on the United States Supreme Court. It stopped us in our tracks. Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in New York. The decisions made by the nation's highest court are ones of massive consequence, something not even lost on its members. They are decisions that forever change the lives of every American. And yet, what we've been seeing recently from the United States Supreme Court is a striking and deeply disturbing appearance, at least, that politics now plays a much larger role than ever before in those decisions. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who you just heard there, warned publicly years ago about this very thing, questioning whether the court would survive the stench of politics during oral arguments in the Dobbs case. That stench is now not in question in the minds of the public, as there have been many troubling, very public appearances of political inclinations and leanings by certain justices of the court, with major decisions before it having to do with the January 6th insurrection and presidential immunity. Justice Clarence Thomas's wife was directly involved in the events and the mission and the ideas that led to the deadly insurrection on January 6th, both the fake electors plot and every other element of the crime that day. Recent reporting found that 2 flags flown by insurrectionists at the United States Capitol on January 6th were also flown at 2 homes owned by Justice Samuel Alito. Responding to calls for his recusal from the January 6 cases, Justice Alito blamed his wife, as I suppose one does, by saying, quote, "My wife is fond of flying flags. I am not," end quote. Even Chief Justice John Roberts declined to defend his court's credibility. In a letter to Senate Democrats, he said a meeting to discuss ethics at the court would raise concerns about the separation of powers and judicial independence. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a recipient of that letter from Roberts, called the argument nearly ludicrous and said, quote, "I think if you're the Supreme Court of the United States, telling a skeptical public and the Congress to go pound sand is not the appropriate tone." We think he was being diplomatic. A moment of crisis and confidence for the nation's highest court, as its approval amid the American people remains near record lows. Meanwhile, over the next month, a batch of key court rulings will come down. Some could be out as soon as tomorrow. New York Times reports this, quote, "No Supreme Court in recent memory has featured so many cases with the potential to transform American society." The consequential cases, with decisions arriving by late June or early July, include 3 affecting former President Donald Trump, 2 on abortion, 2 on guns, 3 on the First Amendment rights of social media companies, and 3 on the administrative state. It's where we start the hour with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat of Rhode Island, a member of the Judiciary Committee. You've sort of been a one-man siren, I know, for decades on the trajectory of the Supreme Court, and here we are. A record low number of the American people actually thinks the Supreme Court is doing a good job. Even fewer think that they are ethical in going about their business. I wanted to ask you about Justice Sotomayor's very vulnerable personal note, that she sometimes goes back to her office and cries.
I think she may not be the only American who reads some of these decisions and goes to their office or room and cries. But I think the key point here isn't that she is personally touched and affected by it. The key point here is that these decisions connect to this terrible pattern of the court, the billionaire gifts program of travel and jets and vacations and rent and tuitions, an epidemic of non-disclosure at the court about those gifts or about reasons why recusals should or should not have happened. And then flotillas of front group amici funded by the billionaires who put these justices on the court, and an appalling pattern of following in the decisions the outcomes recommended by the front group amici, even if it means propping the decisions up with false fact-finding. So there's a real deep problem there that the court doesn't seem to recognize, and that goes well beyond a sad emotional reaction to one of its worst decisions.
Senator, let's unpack some of those items while we have you here. We are waiting for an imminent ruling on immunity for Donald Trump, on presidential immunity. And I think if you rewind the clock, this was something Jack Smith asked them to hear on a schedule that would have allowed a trial before Judge Tanya Chutkan on Trump's, the crimes he's been indicted for around the January 6th insurrection to happen, so the American people could see those facts adjudicated in a court of law ahead of the election. They rejected that. But then at Donald Trump's request, they agreed to hear his arguments. What are you girding for in that issue?
Well, I think the worst circumstance would be that the two conflicted justices, Thomas and Alito, actually tip the decision on some issue one way or the other. If they're just a dissent of two, then it's probably going to be less significant. But if for any reason they are the balance point and they tip the decision in a particular direction, given the conflicts of interest, the very obvious conflicts of interest that they have, then I think that becomes really, really dark. The court missed a huge opportunity here. This should have been a 9-0 decision right away. The last time that the court was leaning in to help a Republican president get into office was Bush v. Gore. And they decided that case the day after oral argument. Here, months and months have gone by when it appears to, I think, most scholars and lawyers, this is an obvious case. This is kind of a slam dunk case. Presidents are not above the law. That's not a difficult proposition. So the whole spin out of it by this court is redolent of the bad old days of Bush v. Gore.
Well, there's Bush v. Gore, but there's also the 14th Amendment case, which was this particular makeup of the Supreme Court. They were able to render judgment in pretty short order.
Yeah, when they want to, they can be quick. So it implies some degree of willfulness about the delay. And I think that the delay in this case is as significant to the outcome for a second-term President Trump as the actual merits of the decision. Because if he can delay it and then becomes president, he shuts down the investigation, it's over, and that's just as good as having won the case. So this is not a matter in which the delay doesn't matter. The delay is the substance.
Senator, the flags that the Alitos have flown at their two homes are flags that any Google image search of the day of January 6th will show you both those flags being waved by Trump supporters who stormed the U.S. Capitol, led to the death of multiple law enforcement officials, and had the stated objective of, quote, hanging Mike Pence. What do you make of the snub from John Roberts in the wake of what should be, in his own view, a crisis of confidence in the court's members?
Well, there are two things that stand out. The first is that the court on ethics matters, like when it's proper to recuse, is supposed to consider the appearance of bias and impropriety. And nothing says appearance more than flying a flag. You may have your excuses as to what in your inner heart you actually meant, but if you're attentive to public concern, the appearance of bias has been met by flying that flag over your house while you're ruling on MAGA and insurrection-related cases. The second thing is that we've had to count on the factual description of what took place of Justice Alito, which appears to be in conflict with corroborated statements. And so it exposes yet again the absence of a proper fact-finding process at the Supreme Court about these allegations. The justices get to make up their own facts about what took place. And those 9 individuals are the only ones in the entire government who get to do that. Even President Biden had to sit for an interview about the documents in his garage. Everybody is amenable to investigation, to having to make a statement, all of that, and the court just refuses to apply that foundational principle of process of law to itself.
I spend an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out what's wrong with them at a leadership level and a personal level, and it's probably unhealthy. But I wonder how 2 of 9 humans on a body with that much power and privilege could be so embittered and so angry and so thankless towards the nation that gave them that honor, that they would proudly sort of embrace the symbols of the greatest stain in our country's modern history, right? The first ever violent transfer of power was the insurrection. And you've got 2 of 9.
Yeah.
Like, do you have a theory of what happened to Alito and Thomas, that they're both married to women who proudly embrace the substance and or symbols of the insurrection?
I would be making wild guesses. I mean, I think that they probably built up a good deal of rancor over the years when they didn't have a majority around Roberts and they had to contain what they were there for. I mean, if you think of them as right-wing moles having to sit there festering at the Supreme Court, waiting until they had a big enough majority to do what they were sent to do, and then they finally have the great day when they can do it, and they can let the unlimited dark money flow, and they can take away abortion rights, and they can shut down the Voting Rights Act and do all these great things. And instead of getting cheers for it, they are criticized. They're thin-skinned and they're criticized. But it's almost like, the cicadas have come out after years of just sitting there in the dark. Now they're showing who they really were all along, and there's a lot of resentment wrapped up in all of that. But they should be able to fix it still, Yeah. If they can take away the rights of every woman in America to control her own reproductive future by 6-3, then by God, they ought to be able to pass a rule about their own conduct and have some proper fact-finding also by 6-3. Why does that have to be unanimous when they're willing to take away rights by simple majorities, willing to create a dark money empire by a simple majority of 5-4?
What do you say? I mean, I've interviewed some of your colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, Senators Blumenthal and others, and they seem to articulate a lack of tools available to all of you. Do you think that is true? Do you feel like there's more that the committee can do, or is this really a political issue for the American voters to fix?
I think it's a mix of things. We have bills that we can pass. The Supreme Court ethics bill is already out of committee and waiting on the floor. We have a term limits bill that we can pass. We have investigations that are being blockaded now, but nevertheless are being pretty fruitful. Even the Finance Committee has done a wonderful job discovering the disappearance of the debt of Thomas, the $250,000 debt for his motor coach, and showing very peculiar filings by Harlan Crow about his yacht, where it's sometimes a pleasure craft and sometimes a charter yacht, and nobody ever saw a charter, but he's deducting $8 billion as if it were a charter. So the investigative work is continuing, and if we win the House and the Republicans can't block subpoena enforcement in the Senate by filibuster, then the investigation piece becomes very alive and very healthy. And in the meantime, the good old judicial conference, the colleague judges, the chief judges of all the different circuit courts are banging away little by little, cleaning up messes that are presented to them. So there's been no, sudden dramatic victory, but things are moving, and they're moving in the right direction. And I hope with Chief Justice Roberts' help, they'll move even faster under all this new pressure.
One of the other areas you're investigating, and it's a story that didn't get enough attention. We were covering the trial of Donald Trump here in New York, but it is his pledge at a fundraiser to oil execs to give him, I want to quote him accurately, you could raise $1 billion to return me to the White House. In return, he vowed to reverse dozens of President Biden's environmental rules and policies and stop new ones from being enacted. He said, according to the Washington Post reporting on this from May 9th, giving $1 billion would be a, quote, deal because of the taxation and regulation. impeached once for quid pro quo, but didn't learn his lesson without a conviction, I suppose. What is the status of any investigation into that?
We have letters out, in this case from the Finance Committee, to the oil industry CEOs and participants in that private meeting where that quid pro quo proposal was offered by Trump, and we're awaiting their responses, and then we'll determine how to proceed based on their responses. So TBD, alive and well.
We'll stay on it. We'll stay on it. Senator, we are always appreciative to talk to you. We appreciate your clarity and bluntness on all these issues. Thank you very much for making time to talk to us.
Thanks for having me on.